Pictured here is Pharaoh, believed to have been the adopted mother of Moses. The Pharaoh Amenemhet III very well could have been the foster father of Moses, as many biblical scholars believe his daughter, Pharaoh, was the last ruler of this dynasty, and she had no son to succeed her. She was likely the daughter of Pharaoh, who came down to wash herself at the river, Exodus 2 verse 5. This was not because she had no bathroom at the royal palace. Instead, she would most likely have been there praying to the Nile fertility god, Hapi, for a baby. When the basket containing the baby Moses came to her attention, she may well have considered it an answer to her prayer, but when Moses was 40 years of age, he showed his sympathy for the Israelite slaves by killing one of their oppressors. When this came to the attention of Pharaoh, Moses had to flee to the distant land of Midian. So when Pharaoh died, the dynasty came to an end. Then 40 years after Moses fled, God said to Moses, "All the men are dead who sought your life," Exodus 4 verse 19. He returned to Egypt and confronted one of the pharaohs of the 13th dynasty, possibly Neferhotep I, whose mummy or burial place has never been found, believed by many to have drowned in the Red Sea. When we take the history and chronology of the Bible as written, we find that it makes eminent sense of the archaeological evidence. According to the traditional chronology of Egyptian history, the 18th dynasty ruled from about 1550 to 1320 BC. According to Bible chronology, the Exodus occurred about 1446 BC. But there is no evidence from 18th dynasty Egyptian records of a major disaster such as would have resulted from the 10 devastating plagues that fell on Egypt, or of the destruction of the Egyptian army during this period. Nor is there archaeological evidence for an invasion of Palestine under Joshua during this period. The solution to this problem is a recognition that the chronology of Egypt needs to be reduced by centuries, bringing the 12th dynasty down to the time of Moses and the Exodus. When this is done, there is found abundant evidence for the presence of large numbers of Semitic slaves at the time of Moses, the devastation of Egypt, and the sudden departure of these slaves. Most historians agree that Solomon ascended the throne about 970 BC. His fourth year would be 966 BC, and 480 years before that would be about 1446 BC. According to the traditional dates accepted by most archaeologists, that would be during the rule of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. It is true that there is no evidence for Moses, the 10 plagues that fell upon Egypt, or the Exodus at that time. But there are a number of scholars who claim that a gross error in chronology has been made in calculating the dates of Egyptian history and that they should be reduced by centuries. Such a redating could bring the 12th dynasty down to the time of Moses, and there is plenty of circumstantial evidence in that dynasty to support the biblical records. One of the last kings of the 12th dynasty was Sesostris III. His statues depict him as a cruel tyrant, quite capable of inflicting harsh slavery on his subjects. His son was Amenemhet III, who seems to have been an equally disagreeable character. He probably ruled for 46 years, and Moses would have been born near the beginning of his reign. Amenemhet III may have had one son, known as Amenemhet IV, who was an enigmatic character who may have followed his father or may have been a co-regent with him. If the latter, Amenemhet IV, could well have been Moses. Amenemhet IV mysteriously disappeared off the scene before the death of Amenemhet III. Amenemhet III had a daughter whose name was Pharaoh. It is known that she had no children. If she was the daughter of Pharaoh, who came down to the river to bathe, it is easy to understand why she was there. It was not because she had no bathroom in her palace. She would have been down there, taking a ceremonial ablution and praying to the river god Hapi, who was also the god of fertility. Having no children, she would have needed such a god, and when she found the beautiful baby Moses there, she would have considered it an answer to her prayers, Exodus 2 verses 5 to 6. But when Moses came of age, he identified himself with the people of Israel and was obliged to flee from Egypt. This left a vacuum on the throne, and when Amenemhet III died there was no male successor. Pharaoh ascended the throne and ruled for 8 years as a pharaoh, but when she died the dynasty died and was succeeded by the 13th dynasty. Pharaoh had yielded to Moses' demands to allow his slaves to leave because of the 10 devastating plagues that fell on Egypt, Exodus 7:12. The waters of the sacred river Nile were turned to blood, herds and flocks were smitten with pestilence, lightning set combustible material on fire, hail flattened the crops and struck the fruit trees, and locusts blanketed the country and consumed what might have been left of plant life. The economy of Egypt would have been so shattered that there should be some record of such a national catastrophe, and there is. In the Leiden Museum in Holland is a papyrus written in a later period, but most scholars recognize it as being a copy of a papyrus from an earlier dynasty. It could have been from the 13th dynasty, describing the conditions that prevailed after the plagues had struck.
Nay, but the heart is violent. Plague stalks through the land and blood is everywhere. Nay, but the river is blood. Does a man drink from it? As a human he rejects it. He thirsts for water. Nay, but gates, columns, and walls are consumed with fire. Nay, but men are few. He that lays his brother in the ground is everywhere. Nay, but the son of the high-born man is no longer to be recognized. The stranger people from outside are come into Egypt. Nay, but corn has perished everywhere. People are stripped of clothing, perfume, and oil. Everyone says, there is no more. The storehouse is bare. It has come to this. The king has been taken away by poor men.
There are records of slavery during the reigns of the last rulers of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris III, Amenemhet III, and Sobek-Neferu. Some include an obscure figure known as Amenemhet IV before Sobek-Neferu. With the death of Sobek-Neferu, the 12th dynasty came to an end as she had no children born to her. Moses, the adopted heir, had fled to Midian. A period of instability followed the demise of the 12th dynasty. 14 kings followed each other in rapid succession, the earlier ones probably ruling in the Delta before the 12th dynasty ended. Kings of the 13th dynasty had already started to rule in the northeast Delta, and when the 12th dynasty came to an end, they filled the vacuum and took over as the 13th dynasty. The idea of dynasties was not an Egyptian idea at the time. It was a later invention of Manetho, the Egyptian priest of the 3rd century BC, who left a record of the history of Egypt and divided the kings into dynasties. The elevation to rulership over all Egypt by these kings resulted in fierce contention among themselves, resulting in a rapid succession of rulers and more or less anarchy in the country. This only settled down when Neferhotep IV took the throne and restored some stability, ruling for 11 years. Khasekemre Neferhotep was the pharaoh from whom Moses demanded Israel's release. There was found scarabs of former kings at Kahun, but the latest scarab he found there was of Neferhotep, who was apparently the pharaoh ruling when the Israelite slaves suddenly left Kahun and fled from Egypt in the Exodus. According to Manetho, he was the last king to rule before the Hyksos occupied Egypt without a battle. Without a battle? Where was the Egyptian army? It was at the bottom of the Red Sea, Exodus 14:28. Khasekemre Neferhotep I was probably the pharaoh of the Exodus. His mummy has never been found. Neferhotep, who was apparently the pharaoh ruling when the Israelite slaves suddenly left Kahun and fled from Egypt in the Exodus. According to Manetho, he was the last king to rule before the Hyksos occupied Egypt without a battle. Without a battle? Where was the Egyptian army? It was at the bottom of the Red Sea, Exodus 14:28. Khasekemre Neferhotep, I was probably the pharaoh of the Exodus. His mummy has never been found. Exodus 1:11. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Exodus 12:37. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Those who identify Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus cite these verses, which include the name Ramesses, as evidence to support their identification. But if Ramesses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, his body should be at the bottom of the Red Sea, not in the Cairo Museum where it is today. Wood's argument dispels the necessity of linking the name Ramesses with the biblical references. There is plenty of evidence for Israelite slavery in Egypt. The sudden disappearance of these slaves, the devastation of Egypt by the 10 plagues, the destruction of the Egyptian army. If we look for it at the right time, and time is a vital element in the interpretation of ancient history. According to the biblical records, the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon laid the foundations of his temple at Jerusalem, 1 Kings 6:1. This would place the Exodus about 1446 BC. God's covenant with Abraham was 430 years earlier, Exodus 12:40, Galatians 3:16-17, about 1850 BC. From the ages of his predecessors back to Noah, given in Genesis 12 and 13, it can be calculated that the Great Universal Flood occurred 427 years earlier, about 2302 BC. But according to most authorities on Egyptian chronology, the pyramids were built about 1550 BC, and the first dynasty of Egypt ruled about 3100 BC. Thus, we can now identify the proper time frame and pharaoh that meets the biblical accounts and records. Shalom until the next post.